J.D. Vance, again, not a well-known public figure. He's well-known in conservative circles in large part for his meteoric rise. He's only been in the United States Senate a year and a half. He'd never run for anything before. He's essentially been a protege of a tech billionaire named Peter Thiel, who is the person who personally introduced him to Trump, who funded his Senate campaign, and who gave him all of his jobs. But now here he is, the vice presidential running mate for Donald Trump. I will say that the speech was a very straight-up Republican speech, not a particularly J.D. Vance speech, except for a few charming anecdotes about his family, particularly his grandmother. If it was going to be important for this campaign for Donald Trump's running mate to be an electrifying orator, he was not. He is not. Maybe he is another circumstances. His acceptance speech tonight was not an electrifying speech. He looks a lot like Jerry Falwell Jr., you may remember, from Liberty University. Jerry Falwell Sr., the televangelist, fantastic orator. Jerry Falwell Jr., real estate lawyer, and talks like it. This is much more of a Jerry Falwell Jr. vibe than it was somebody who had oratorical chops. But again, those are style points, not the most important thing in the world. Chris Hayes, I know you were sort of watching with a fact checker's eye toward this.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the approach was a kind of do no harm approach, right? Particularly because this is a guy who went on Tucker Carlson and said the country was ruled by like angry, jealous cat ladies who want to make everyone as miserable as they are. He's the one who tweeted that Democrats basically have blood on their hands after Assassin's Bullet missed the president. Like, his rhetorical mode is incredibly aggressive.
When he was against Trump, he said, what proportion of the U.S. population has Donald Trump sexually assaulted?
Yes.
I mean, that's the kind of, that's what his natural tone is.
That is his natural tone. This was not that tone, which I think was a deft choice if you're introducing him to the country, not to like berate the miserable cat ladies. I think was probably smart rhetorically. Substantively, you know, he did this riff about Joe Biden's political career in which he did say some true things. The trade deals that Joe Biden did in fact favor, trade deals which he said Donald Trump opposed, which is also true. Donald Trump did oppose NAFTA and most favored nation status. He said Donald Trump opposed the Iraq war, which is not true, and a thing we had to litigate over and over and over in 2016. He also seemed to make it that the Iraq war, we lived through it, was a democratic war. It was not. It was run by George W. Bush, probably ardently supported by many of the people in that hall with him.
Yes.
I was there, actually, for that convention that year. The last thing I'll just say, which is not really a fact-checking point, but I think is important, is there's a story he's telling about basically the kind of neoliberal gutting of the American industrial base, what it did to those manufacturing towns in America, and how it betrayed the American working man, and that Joe Biden was, a symbol of that. And what he left out of that is the Biden economic policy, which has created 800,000 manufacturing jobs and the most remarkable manufacturing investment and insourcing we have seen in generations, is precisely aimed at and has been wildly successful at restoring the American industrial base, focusing on manufacturing jobs, focusing on unionized manufacturing jobs, focusing on those jobs in places that are far away from the enclaves of liberal metropolitan areas.
And jobs for which you specifically do not need a college degree?
Correct.
Yes, exactly.
So this entire sort of story he's telling, which has some truth to it as a matter of history, chops off what has happened in the last 4 years, which has been in some ways a pretty Vance-ish kind of approach to industrial policy. The last thing I'll say, and I'm going to beat this drum until I put a tear in it, is that America is producing more oil now than any nation in the history of the world has ever produced ever. So everyone's got their like talking points from 2008, and they go up on stage and they say drill baby drill, and the fact of the matter is the spigots are as open as they get. They're turned all the way open. We're just pumping oil out of the ground like no one's ever seen. These are the facts. It just drives me insane. You can say that's bad. You can say that's good. It just is the case that we are right now the global force, the global hegemon in energy in a way we probably haven't ever been in my life.
Yeah. And imagine if the Republicans had that to brag about, you'd never hear the end of it.
Correct.
With Joe Biden having that to brag about, again, arguably, if you want to brag about that, Republicans are not only pretending that it hasn't happened, but attacking them as if they will somehow embody his record instead of him. Lawrence.
So the previous three Republican presidents would not recognize this as a Republican speech. To the anti-NAFTA stuff, it should be remembered that the NAFTA negotiations began under President Ronald Reagan. They were almost entirely completed under President George H.W. Bush, and then Bill Clinton picked up what had been left, the work done prior to that, and got it passed fairly quickly. mostly with Republican votes, more Republican votes than Democratic votes. Okay. That's the history of it. What Donald Trump did with NAFTA is exactly what you do with trade agreements like that, which is they just updated it. It's still NAFTA. It's still there. Everything, the basis of it was still in place. So no one has actually done anything to significantly change NAFTA. And then if you could quote only two lines, and this goes to George W. Bush. The disastrous invasion of Iraq. That's what he just called it, the disastrous invasion of Iraq. There was a 2004 convention celebrating that invasion. That convention was held in New York City, and this pretending it didn't happen, pretending it wasn't us, and applying it to Joe Biden. Joe Biden supported the disastrous invasion of Iraq. That was the sentence, because he voted for it in the Senate, as did most Democratic senators. And then the other one, the line that I think the audience can work on this one themselves. We won't cater to Wall Street, we'll commit to the working man. That's in a Republican vice president's accepting the nomination speech. And as I sat here stylistically, in terms of, a convention speaker, I had to think back. I was trying to remember, what was Dick Cheney's speech like? Oh. I think it was a little more exciting. And I know Dan Quayle's was better. And I don't know. You have to go back to, Richard Nixon maybe to find something as flat as that as a vice presidential speech.
Is that your critique of it, that it was flat, that it was just boring?
So the lines were written for the surge from the crowd, and he didn't get it. And so I was wondering two things about that. I mean, one of these lines was, so the invasion of Iraq line was actually written for a surge that he didn't get. There was no response to it at all. There was no response to a bunch of these lines. And I wondered, is it the crowd? Do they not think? Are those not winning lines with this crowd anymore? Are they exhausted? Or is it his fault as a speaker? And I suspect that it was his fault in his rhythms. He just didn't have, Mike Pence did that preacher thing. He did that Christian preacher thing, which that audience understands and knows how to respond to the rhythms of it. He didn't have any rhythms, but we'll see. It's his first one. We'll see how.
There was a rhythmic outbreak at one point during the speech when the crowd spontaneously said, "Joe must go, Joe must go," and Vance looked very pleased and allowed that to happen. And then when it started dying down, he said, "I agree." And it was like, whoa, wait a second.
He didn't lift them. And that's what these speeches can do. It can take them where they are and then lift them. He didn't lift them a bit.
No.
I will note that Peter Navarro, Jacob Soboroff reported when we were on earlier that he lifted the crowd, but it was when he threw them red hot meat.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And this speech just seemed to be designed to do the opposite, to make sure that he did not have more charisma than the nominee, that he sort of seemed like his sort of nice grandson, who didn't really do any harm. He didn't convey the radicalism that you so brilliantly laid out in the open. Instead, he gave us normal. He kind of gave us something similar to what Donald Trump ran on in 2016, which was the Man of Steel speech, where they just talked about we're going to, the heart and soul of America is going to be renewed by Donald Trump. Just a couple of things. He said, this was, I thought, a pretty well-written line. America's ruling class wrote the checks. Communities like mine paid the price. For decades, that divide between the few with their power and comfort in Washington and the rest of us only widened. Take Washington out of there and put Wall Street and the hedge funds that he comes from. This is somebody who, as you pointed out, is the creature of Peter Thiel. He's not he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, but other than writing that book, what has he done that has impacted in a positive way? And what is he proposing that has impacted in a positive way the working class? Meanwhile, here is an Associated Press headline from today. America's aging infrastructure is getting an upgrade. The I-95 bridge that connects Tennessee and Arkansas across the Mississippi River is going to be upgraded. This funding It was provided by big infrastructure, President Biden's infrastructure bill. If you drive anywhere in this country right now, you see what I would call Biden bucks, and they should probably just call it that at this point. You see this infrastructure spending happening everywhere. You see it more if you're in a red state. I saw it more when I was down south. I saw it more even in Louisiana, someplace that Biden will not win, but you could physically see it. And you see these workers with jobs. That's provided by Joe Biden. Joe Biden actually, this is a speech that actually could have been written for Joe Biden, because Joe Biden has governed as a working class guy. He's a genuinely working class person, and his programs and policies have been hugely beneficial, not just to the working class, but to the working class in red states. And the proof of that is that all these Republicans are running around taking credit for it, and they voted against it. But they're running around at the groundbreakings, at the Joe Biden programs that he's providing for the working class.
Alex.
I know that there was not the same red meat sort of blood and soil nationalism that you might hear in, I don't know, other parallel universe Republican conventions. But I do think there were some sort of Easter eggs of white nationalism in the speech. One of the things that stuck out to me was when he started talking about what America is. He said, America is not just an idea. It is a group of people with a shared history and a common future. The thing about America is that it's not a group of people with shared history. In fact, I think a lot of people would argue it's quite the opposite. It's a lot of people with different histories, different heritages.
His in-laws don't share the history.
Exactly. And that's the other piece of it. He goes on, he went a long sort of a paragraph at least about this plot in eastern Kentucky where his 7 or 6 generations of his family are buried. And his hope is that his wife and he are eventually laid to rest there and their kids follow them. And I sort of understand the idea of sharing the burial plot, but it also it reveals someone who believes that the history that the family should inherit, and indeed the history that should be determinative in the story of the Vance family, is the history of the Eastern Kentucky Vances, and not the Vances from San Diego, which is where his wife is from and where her Indian parents are from. But in America, it doesn't always have to be the white male lineage that trumps that defines the family history, that branch of the tree supersedes all else. And I just think the construction of this notion reveals a lot about someone who fundamentally believes in the supremacy of whiteness and masculinity. And it's couched in a sort of halcyon, revisitation of his roots, but it is actually really revealing about what he thinks matters and who America is. And that America is a place for people with a shared Western background. And that is the idea of America. That is the nation of America that he wants to resurrect.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.